Hello everybody, I am Evelil and I will tell you one story of a good viewing. The orphanage sat in a desolate corner of the world, nestled deep in a forgotten forest, far from any town or civilization. Its towering stone structure, with windows that were more like slits, cast long shadows over the forgotten yard. No one knew exactly when the orphanage was built, but the children inside would have sworn it had always been there, as though it had grown from the very soil. Its high walls and endless corridors seemed to bend time itself, trapping the children in a place that existed outside of all human understanding. The children who lived in the orphanage were not like other children. They couldn't speak. The doctors had never been able to explain it, but no child who entered the orphanage ever uttered a single word. Their eyes were wide, filled with an eerie understanding of things no child should know, but their mouths remained sealed in a perfect, unsettling silence. They communicated only through gestures, expressions, and an unnatural stillness in their movements. Some whispered rumors of a curse, others of experiments gone wrong, but no one ever really dared to ask questions. The orphanage had its own rules, and one of the most important ones was silence. But as time went on, things began to change. It started small, subtle at first. A low hum that echoed through the walls, a faint mechanical whirring that seemed to come from the very bones of the orphanage. The children couldn't place the sound, but it was there. It grew louder, creeping into their dreams at night, swirling around them like a dark presence. It wasn't the sound of wind or water, it was far more unnerving. Something was moving beneath the walls, beneath the floors. Something mechanical, something alive. One night, as the children lay in their narrow, cold beds, the sound became unbearable. It wasn't just a hum anymore, it was a grinding, like metal scraping against metal, punctuated by sharp clicks and thuds. The walls seemed to vibrate, and the floor beneath them seemed to tremble in response. The older children huddled together, their faces pale, their wide eyes flicking nervously toward the ceiling as though the noise was coming from above them. A few of the younger children buried their faces in their blankets, too frightened to look, but they couldn't escape the sound. It was everywhere, pressing down on them from all sides. The silence, which had always been so oppressive, was now filled with something far worse. As the nights passed, the children began to notice changes in themselves. Their movements became stiff, jerky, almost as if their bodies were no longer fully their own. It was subtle at first. A twitch in the fingers. A strange tick in the eye. Then the children began to move differently. They walked with mechanical precision, their movements unnervingly synchronized as though they were all following the same unseen conductor. When they ate, their hands would lift the spoon, bring it to their lips, and lower it with the same exact rhythm. No one spoke of it, but everyone noticed. One evening, as the children sat in the dimly lit dining hall, a strange thing happened. The doors that led to the kitchen, which were usually locked and reinforced with thick iron bars, creaked open on their own. The children's eyes widened in unison, their bodies stiffening at the unnatural movement. From within the darkness of the kitchen came a shadow, a figure, or rather, a shape that seemed to flicker in and out of existence, its edges frayed like the static of an old television set. It was tall, too tall, and its movements were not like those of a human. It slithered across the floor in jerks and twitches, its limbs elongating unnaturally with each step. The children didn't move. They didn't make a sound. They just watched. The figure paused at the edge of the doorway, its head tilting to one side as if observing them. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were hollow, black voids, and they seemed to pierce through the children with an unearthly intensity. The children couldn't look away. They couldn't move. It was as if the figure had an unnatural control over them, like it was manipulating their every breath and heartbeat. And then, without a sound, the figure vanished back into the shadows of the kitchen, leaving the door creaking closed behind it. The children remained motionless, staring at the door, their bodies trembling but still frozen in place. They didn't dare to move. The next morning, the children found themselves once again drawn into their routines. But something had changed. The air was heavier, as though the orphanage had taken on a new presence, a presence that pressed against the very walls, the floors, the ceilings. Something was growing inside the house, something far darker than anything the children had ever known. And it wasn't just the walls that were changing. The children were changing too. The first child to truly notice it was Eliza, a thin, pale girl with long, dark hair that hung like a veil over her face. She had been at the orphanage longer than most of the other children, having arrived when she was very young. She was quiet, even for one of them, always sitting alone in the corner, watching the other children with a look of deep concentration. She noticed the movements first, the jerky motions, the strange lack of fluidity in their steps. She felt it in herself too, the way her fingers seemed to twitch without her control, the way her limbs moved in slow, deliberate motions. It wasn't just her. It was all of them. The children were no longer acting like children. They moved with a kind of precision as though their bodies were being controlled by something outside of them. They had no control over their own movements. Their eyes had become glassy and distant as though they were watching the world through a fogged glass. They were like puppets, their strings pulled by an unseen force. And then, one night, the doors to the orphanage opened on their own, and in the darkness of the courtyard, the children saw it. A figure. Larger than before, its body a strange amalgamation of wires and flesh. It was a mechanical creature, but it was alive, pulsing with a strange, unnatural energy. Its limbs moved with a grotesque fluidity, and its eyes, those same hollow, black voids, stared at them with a hunger that made their blood run cold. The children tried to scream, but their voices were lost. They couldn't make a sound. It was then that Eliza realized the horrible truth. The orphanage itself had become part of them. The walls, the floor, the very air, they were all becoming mechanical. And the children? They were no longer human. They had become part of the machine. As the figure in the courtyard took a step forward, the children's bodies began to move in unison, jerking toward the door as though they were being pulled by an invisible force. They couldn't stop. They couldn't fight it. The silence was no longer just oppressive. It was suffocating. And the children realized with a terrible clarity that this was only the beginning. The children, now trapped within their own mechanical movements, felt themselves drawn like marionettes toward the courtyard. Their bodies jerked and twisted in unnatural patterns as they stumbled toward the open door. The once silent halls of the orphanage reverberated with the sound of their collective, synchronized steps. There was no way to stop themselves. They couldn't scream, couldn't protest. The whispers of their consciousness drowned beneath the hum of gears and pistons that seemed to beat in time with their hearts. As they stepped into the cold night air, the dark figure stood waiting in the courtyard. It wasn't just a machine anymore, it had grown. Its limbs were longer, thinner, and more fluid, as though it were adapting, evolving. A harsh mechanical grinding filled the space, and the ground trembled beneath them. There was something wrong about it. The figure seemed to pulse, its form fluctuating between something human and something monstrous, as if it couldn't decide what it was supposed to be. The children were no longer themselves. Their minds, once sharp and vivid, were clouded by an overwhelming compulsion, a force that made them march toward the creature. They stood in a line, facing the figure, their bodies trembling but still locked in place by whatever force had taken control of them. Their eyes were wide, empty, nothing but black holes in their faces, staring into the dark abyss. The figure raised one of its arms, the mechanical joints creaking, and the children's bodies obeyed, moving without thought, without resistance. They all reached out with their hands, their fingers twitching involuntarily. And just as they did, something cold and sharp wrapped around their wrists, pulling them forward. The children tried to resist, but their hands were drawn toward the figure like iron filings to a magnet. Their minds screamed for release, but their bodies were no longer theirs to command. The creature's hollow eyes shifted from one child to the next, studying them as if it were analyzing every small movement. It seemed to be feeding on them, using their energy to fuel its grotesque transformation. Slowly, it stepped forward, moving in strange jerks, like something half-finished, something not fully alive. A grinding noise filled the air as the creature's body twisted and contorted, its joints screeching in protest. It wasn't supposed to be like this. It wasn't supposed to evolve this way. The mechanical parts, the wires, the metal, all of it was trying to merge with the flesh. And then the horror truly began. The first child, young Emily, the smallest of them all, suddenly collapsed to the ground. Her body twisted violently, her limbs stretching in ways they should not have been able to. Her skin split open with a sickening tearing sound, revealing the machine beneath. Her insides were no longer organs, no longer flesh. They were wires, gears, and pulsing red lights. Her face contorted in silent agony, her mouth gaping open as though she were trying to scream, but nothing came out. The other children, horrified, tried to look away, but their bodies kept moving toward her, kept pushing them closer. It was as though the force controlling them wanted them to watch. And then it happened again. Another child's body began to contort, his bones cracking under the strain as metal began to emerge from his skin. His fingers elongated into thin, jagged blades, his spine twisting in an unnatural, inhuman shape. His mouth opened in a silent scream, but the sound of grinding metal filled the space instead, a high-pitched screech that echoed through the courtyard, piercing the night. The children were no longer children. They were becoming part of the machine. Their bodies, once warm and living, were being turned into something else, something cold, something mechanical. The transformation was slow but inevitable, like an infestation. The creature was feeding on them, using their innocence, their fear, to fuel its growth. Eliza watched in horror as the last of the children fell, their bodies writhing and twitching as they were slowly consumed by the machine. She wanted to scream, wanted to run, but her limbs, her body, were no longer hers to control. The horrible grinding noise grew louder, the sound of metal twisting and flesh tearing, until it became almost unbearable. Through the haze of terror, Eliza caught sight of something in the distance, a flicker of light. Her mind struggled to focus, to make sense of the scene in front of her, but there it was, a small, faint glow that seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. It came from the orphanage, the heart of the house itself. The orphanage wasn't just a building. It was alive. It had always been alive. With every flicker of the light, the mechanical hum grew louder, the walls of the orphanage vibrating as though they, too, were awakening from a deep slumber. Eliza felt it, the strange, cold presence of the orphanage, the living machine that had brought them all here, that had made them what they were. And then she understood. The orphanage was feeding on them, too. The children, their bodies, their energy, they were all being drained, converted into parts for something much greater, much darker than they could have ever imagined. The creature's arms reached out again, this time grasping Eliza's shoulders with terrifying strength. Its fingers, cold and metallic, pressed into her skin, pulling her toward the heart of the orphanage. She struggled, her mind fighting against the invisible force, but it was futile. Her limbs moved of their own accord, her body betraying her every effort to escape. And then she was inside the orphanage again. The walls stretched high above her, far higher than they had ever seemed before. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of rust and oil, and the humming sound was deafening now. It was everywhere, inside the walls, inside her head. Eliza stumbled forward, her mind still fighting, but the force that controlled her was relentless. She was drawn deeper into the building, her steps taken in unison with the others. She could feel them, could feel the other children, their souls still lingering in the mechanical parts that had once been their bodies. The orphanage was hungry. It needed them all. Finally, they reached the center of the building. The heart. It was a giant mechanical contraption, a massive web of gears, pulleys, and metal tendrils that seemed to reach out like skeletal arms, pulling the very essence of life into itself. The children's bodies, once soft and warm, were now nothing more than parts, pieces of a machine designed for one purpose, to feed the heart. The creature that had led them here stepped back, its hollow eyes fixed on the heart, its form flickering in and out of existence like a glitch in the system. And then, with a sickening crunch, the heart of the orphanage began to beat. It was no longer a sound. It was a sensation. It was the pulse of something alive. And the children, now just parts of the machine, could do nothing but wait. Thank you very much and see you all in the next video. Love you guys.